Welcome to the Gita in Action podcast. My name's Radha, and I'm here with our regular family of seekers. And we finished chapter 5, and today we are going to kind of go over actually what we're going to do. We're going to do the chapter 5 overview, but I kind of we're going to go through every single verse. We're not going to read every verse, but I'll kind of try to give some points from each verse such that we can kind of see the transition and the flow of chapter 5 overall. And what I was hoping we could do today is that I'll go through that, and then maybe some of you could share either some things that stood out to you from chapter 5, things that maybe I said or I didn't say, or things that kind of resonated with you and you kind of saw play out in your lives. So anyway, with that, let's just get right into it. And we're not even going to read any verses today. We're going to try to just kind of flow through without reading any verses. So to start off, in this chapter, Krishna speaks about three key ideas. And so chapter 5, I'm going to kind of divide into three different sections to talk about. The first section is text 1 through 6. And this is where Krishna explains that both karma yoga, which is the path of detached action, so acting in the world but being detached from the results, right? And jnana yoga, that's the path of knowledge and renunciation. So that's where, like, going out into the forest and just meditating, not being engaged in action, right? Jnana yoga. He's saying that in this first section that they both ultimately lead to the same goal, which is liberation. But he's saying that karma yoga is easier and more practical, especially for those of us that are active by nature. It's easier for this age. So then the rest of the chapter after that shows how karma yoga, the yoga of action, leads to liberation in two different stages. So the first stage, and this is talked about in verse 7 through 16, the first stage is getting to know oneself, by knowing oneself to be the ātma, the eternal soul, right? And acting without attachment. One becomes free from bondage. And then the second stage is by fixing the mind on the Supersoul, God within the heart. And through that, one can attain full liberation and peace. So that's the rest of the chapter. Those are the three sections. Okay, the first section, again, is explaining how karma yoga is the recommended path over jnana yoga. Okay, and then the next section after that, Stacy, we're doing a chapter 5 overview today. So we're going to go through all of the verses and kind of see how they transition and flow together. So right now I'm just talking about the three different sections that we're going to talk about. So after that section, in verses 7 through 16, Krishna talks about how knowing oneself to be the eternal soul and acting without attachment, you can be free from bondage. And then that's like level 1. And then level 2 is by fixing the mind on Supersoul, on God within the heart. And that way you can attain full liberation and peace. So it's kind of like a progression. So in this way, Krishna is encouraging Arjuna and all of us to act in the world without doubt or fear, knowing that this path of karma yoga, rooted in knowledge and devotion, can lead us to complete freedom. All right, so now let's walk through the key points of each section, starting with text 1 through 6, where Krishna emphasizes that karma yoga and jnana yoga both reach the same destination, but karma yoga is more accessible. So that's the first section we're going to focus on here. So as chapter 5 begins, if we remember way back, we've been on this chapter for a little while, so it's been a minute. But as chapter 5 begins, if we remember in the first verse, Arjuna still has a question. He asks Krishna to clarify something. He says, you've spoken about renunciation of action, and you've also spoken about working in devotion. Which of the two is better? Because if we remember, Arjuna's confused, should he go off into the forest and renounce, or should he fight? He's still kind of trying to figure out which option is best. And Krishna's answer in verse 5-2 is clear. He says karma yoga is better. Why? Because renunciation of action is difficult without purification. And in this age, most of us are not ready for total renunciation. So he says karma yoga is better. He says by working in devotion, by doing our duties for God, that purifies the heart while we're still engaged in life. So in that way, it's more practical and accessible, especially in this age. So it's not that Krishna is rejecting renunciation. He's just redefining it. He's redefining it by saying that real renunciation, it's not about giving up things externally. He's saying it's about letting go internally, right? So renouncing that attachment to results, to ego, to control. That's kind of the redefinition of renunciation. And in that way, we can still act. So this is what he explains in verse 5:3. When he says, the truly renounced person is not someone who stops acting. It's someone who acts without hating or desiring the fruits of their work. So in that state, we're free from dualities like success and failure, pleasure and pain. We're not acting for the result. We're acting as a service to Krishna. And how do we get to that place? It comes from knowing who we are. And it comes from the soul, and what our relationship with God is. We're not meant to be the controller. We're meant to serve. And when we serve God, the dualities of the material world lose their grip on us. And this is real liberation. And it can even happen while we're still living in this world. And that's a big takeaway from this section. So in 5:4, in text 4, Krishna tackles a common confusion. Some people think that karma yoga and jnāna-yoga, there are opposing paths. One is acting in the world and one is kind of going away from the world, reclusing from the world. But Krishna says only the ignorant see it this way. He says that both paths, if practiced properly, lead to the same result. So one says detach and renounce, and the other says stay engaged but act with detachment. But either way, the goal is the same. The goal is the same, whether we're acting with internal renunciation or externally we're renounced. Either way, the goal is the same, and that is self-realization and freedom from bondage. But the deeper point here is that neither path is complete without devotion. Neither path is complete without devotion. And that's what verse 5:5 emphasizes. It says, if we truly understand where these paths are going, we'll see that they both lead to the same truth, right? Realizing the self and connecting with the Supreme. And in that mature stage, this connection becomes bhakti. So this is where all the paths culminate. That's where all the paths culminate, loving service to God. So from the outside, one path might look like detachment and the other might look like attachment. But in truth, detachment from matter and attachment to God are not in conflict. They go together. So when we attach ourselves to God, detachment from illusion naturally follows. So ultimately, they're going towards the same goal. They're just going about it different ways. So in verse 5:6, Krishna warns us. He says, just renouncing everything without engaging in devotional service doesn't bring happiness. So we can't sustain a path of negation alone. We can't just renounce from the world without connecting to something higher, right? Or we'll fall back down. We're not meant to just let go. We're meant to connect. And this is where bhakti comes in. Only bhakti, this devotion, gives us the joy, the fulfillment, and the love that we're searching for. But trying to renounce without devotion, it's like trying to fast without ever eating real food. Eventually we'll feel empty and we'll likely turn back to the very things we were trying to give up. So it's not enough just to renounce from the world, but we have to connect to something higher. And that's the point here. And this is how bhakti ties in as the culmination to everything. So we can either walk away from the world and connect to something higher, or we can connect to something higher now, and over time, gradually, our material attachments will fade away. But either way, the goal is the same, and that's the connection with the Supreme. And someone who works in devotion, who acts not for the result, but out of love for God, quickly attains the Supreme. Because they're not trying to escape the world or control it, but they're offering their life, their life, their energy, their heart to God. And that offering liberates them. So throughout this chapter, we see, not just karma yoga, which is just acting with detachment, but Krishna brings it all the way to the perfection of karma yoga, which is bhakti yoga, which is when you're not just acting with detachment, but you're acting with love and devotion to God. The point being that all these paths are valid paths. They all culminate in bhakti, but there's things that we can take it and we can learn from all of them. So that's the first section, text 1-6, where again, he talks a lot about the differences between jnana-yoga, renouncing, and karma yoga, acting, and ultimately recommends karma yoga. Does anybody want to share anything or have any questions before we move on to the next section? Oh, Katie. Yes,
Thank
please
you.
share.
Thank you. Hi. Yeah, I just also loved the pointing out and the reminder to consider like the material context, and that in this uh Kali Yuga, it's good to be an example and not totally renunciate and go away from everyone. And then that's important and supportive of each other. Um, yeah, and then I think that's just a good general reminder for me that um there's a lot of quarrel and hypocrisy, and we need to remember our material surroundings, and of course remember they're not, they're not the number one thing. They're not even nearly as they're not actually so real, in terms of what we know to be the absolute truth and Krishna. But in terms of like thinking about how these paths weave together and what's recommended for this age, including the Maha Mantra, we're lucky to have these more distinct instructions, and they're very helpful to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, first off, it's hard to practice some of these more, reclusive paths in this age, just like you said. And then second off, even if you are qualified, better to set an example like we learned in chapter 3. Yeah, so very nice. Thank you, Katie. Okay, so the next section of chapter 5 is we're going to bookend here is text 7-16. Text 7-16. And here Krishna is revealing that by understanding ourselves as the soul, we can remain free from material bondage. So that's like the first step before even like oftentimes before you can really understand or connect with God. It's just understanding that we're a soul, that we're not matter, that we're spirit. Again, just in the progression, in the yogic progression. You don't necessarily have to do the yogic progression, but this can be a step in the ladder, if that makes sense. Okay, so in this section, Krishna's going to begin to elaborate on the promise that he made in those earlier verses, that by working in devotion, a person can remain free from bondage. Okay, so in text 5-7, he describes the qualities of such a person. One who works in devotion, one who is pure in soul, one who has controlled their mind and senses. Such a person is not only free within themselves, but also lives in harmony with others. Everyone is dear to them, and they are dear to everyone. That's what he says. And even though they're constantly engaged in activity, they remain untouched by the binding effects of work. They don't get overly attached to their work. Right? They're at that higher level. And this is the first phase of spiritual equality in karma yoga. It's not about where you live, whether in a palace or a forest. Wherever you live, it doesn't matter. It's about your internal detachment. If you're not attached, you won't become bound, no matter your circumstances. You can be a king living in a beautiful, opulent palace, having everything you want, or you could ever aspire for, but you're detached from it, and that's the difference. And we talked about this a lot. You could be a renunciate who doesn't have much, but you're incredibly attached to it. You're incredibly attached to the little thing that you do have. So the renunciation is in the mind, right? The renunciation is internal. When we're Krishna conscious, we live in the world, but our heart belongs to Krishna. This is, again, the perfection of karma yoga. This is bhakti yoga. We work not for personal gain, but as an offering to him. because our actions are rooted in love and devotion. This is again like what we're aspiring for. Our consciousness becomes pure. We remain steady, even in life's ups and downs. And our connection to God makes us naturally humble, kind, and compassionate towards all living beings. So in this chapter, and really all throughout the Gita, Krishna is giving us, the details of karma yoga, and then he's giving us like the perfection of karma yoga. Because again, karma yogis are just detached from their actions, detached from the results of their work. But the perfection of that is when they're not just detached, but they're attached to God, right? They're doing it out of love and devotion for God. And that's bhakti yoga when it progresses to that place. Okay, so Krishna is assuring Arjuna that if he acts like this, he will stay free from entanglement. Okay, so then in text 8 and 9, Krishna introduces another dimension of this inner freedom. He's saying that even while engaging in normal daily activities, seeing, hearing, walking, eating, sleeping, a transcendentalist understands that I do nothing at all. And this is such a huge point and a huge thing that we can get out of chapter 5 here, is recognizing that the body and the senses are operating in the material world, but the soul remains aloof. There's a difference there, right? And this is where we talked about, this is one of the places that we started talking about the three doers, right? How material nature, or the soul desires, material nature facilitates, and God sanctions. So none of those are the independent doers, right? And so this is the philosophical principle here, that we're not these bodies. We're seated in the body like a driver in a car. Okay? And the soul desires, but to act, it requires a vehicle. And that's what this body is. It's like an instrument to fulfill the soul's desires. And for this to all happen, it also requires the Lord's sanctioning. Okay, so while we initiate actions, we're not the only cause. And that's what we need to take away here, is the three doers. Just like a woodcutter is the cause of chopping a tree, but the axe is also an instrument. Similarly, we're the initiators, but material nature carries out the work. And why is this knowledge important? This knowledge is important because it helps us to detach, right? We get so overly involved in the actions of our body. And without even knowing it, we begin to see ourselves not as doers, but as dependent doers. Right? Reliant on the body, nature, and ultimately Krishna. That's where we want to get to. Okay, but what we end up doing is, because we're so overly involved with the body, is that we see ourselves as doers. Right? We identify as that. And that's the material mode of nature. When we can create some distance here and we see ourselves as the dependent doers, right, reliant on the body, nature, and ultimately God, we have more clarity, right? We're more in touch with reality. So we need to create some distance there, and so that we can better understand how things are actually working. Okay, so in text 5:10, Krishna gives a powerful metaphor. He says, just as a lotus leaf remains untouched by water, a person who offers their work to the Supreme remains untouched by sin. So the lotus lives in water, but is not affected by it. Okay, similarly, the karma yogi lives in the world, but is not entangled by it. And that's what we're going for here. And this happens when you surrender your results to God and you don't get emotionally wrapped up in the outcomes. So this is kind of the progression here. We have to create, our spiritual connection creates that barrier between us getting overly emotional or entangled in the world. And this knowledge helps us to do that, when we can really understand that we're not the body, and that the actions that we are not the independent doers, right? That it's the dependent doers. There's three things involved here: the soul initiating, material nature facilitating, and then ultimately God sanctioning. Okay? So this is what we want to aspire for here, is like a lotus leaf that's remaining untouched by water. The water just kind of rolls off it, That's how we want to be with material nature. Because the more that we're attached to results, the more that we suffer. We all know that. Right? We've all experienced that. Because this attachment breeds ownership. And this ownership is where we get entangled. This ownership mentality. So that's why in text 511, Krishna explains that yogis work with all their faculties, not for selfish gain. So they're not working because they have an idea of what they want at the end. They're working solely for purification. Solely for purification is why they're working. They act without attachment, using their body, their mind, and their intelligence for a higher purpose. Right? And that's to purify themselves. And that means to purify their heart, to free themselves from overly identifying with the body. Right? And when we can do this, when we can become purified, when we can release our over-identification with the body, we're releasing our need to prove, our need to please, our need to possess, right? Those all come from our over-identification with the body. And this is why yogis work, so that they can purify themselves, not so that they can control or manipulate material nature. So in text 512, Krishna compares two types of people. One who is devoted and works without attachment, and then one who is greedy for the fruits of their labor. So the first, the one who is devoted and works without attachment, attains peace. And the second becomes entangled. And it's not the action that binds us. This is an important point. It's not just the action that binds us, it's the motivation. So we really have to check ourselves. Why are we doing what we're doing? Because that's going to bind us. Just like in the example here that we talked about was a soldier who kills for duty is treated differently than someone who kills for pleasure or self-interest. This motivation matters. So when our motivation is more selfless, when our motivation is just a little bit more selfless, we see that we become a little less attached to just our own ego, our own self-centeredness. And that's what we're going for here. We're meant to act. Our nature compels it. It's our nature that's acting, our nature that's influenced by the three modes of nature. That's what's compelling us to act. But when we act without selfishness and offer everything to God, we become free. So then in text 513, Krishna describes the karma yogi, as someone who mentally renounces all actions. So in here, this is the text where he says, well, even while living in the city of 9 gates, that's the body, they reside peacefully, right? Understanding that they're not the doer. Again, this point comes. This is so big. This is so big to understand that we're not the doer. Okay? Fulfill the body's needs, but don't become emotionally entangled with sense objects. So these yogis, they can live in the world, but with inner renunciation. They don't act from false ego, and they don't make others act. They're just observing the machinery of the body functioning under the influence of the modes of nature. They can rightly understand how things are working. And this is where Krishna tells Arjuna, not even I am the doer in battle. He says material nature is acting, and those who understand this don't become bound. So this vision continues in 514, where Krishna says that the soul does not create activity, nor causes others to act. The body acts by its own nature. Okay, the body acts by its own nature. The soul is seated in the machine of the body, but mistakenly identifies with it. And this identity brings suffering. This is where we talked about this brings about all these anarthas, envy, false ego, greed, illusion. I'm forgetting another one. These are the anarthas that are byproducts of this over-identification with the body, right? And this is where we become bound. So we can think of the soul like a passenger in a car, right? The car goes over bumps, but if you think that you're the car, every bump becomes a personal crisis. But if you can remember that you're just the driver, and the body and the car is just the vehicle to get you to that final destination, you can remain peaceful even through the ride. So we have to remember we're not the car. And if we get a little bit scratched up on the journey, don't become overly captivated by it. And that's what Krishna's teaching us here. So then in text 515, Krishna clarifies another potential misunderstanding. He says, it's also not God, it's not the Supreme Lord who's responsible for our good or bad actions. He doesn't interfere with our free will, right? We act according to our desires, and God simply sanctions those desires. So we're not puppets, but we're also not completely independent. Okay, so it's these three doers. This theme keeps coming up. Right? Our choices are influenced by our nature, by our conditioning. And when that nature is covered by ignorance, we act in ways that cause bondage. When we're overly identified with the body and we're covered by ignorance, we act in ways that cause bondage. And that's why Krishna says we suffer not because of the Lord or the soul being doers, but because we're bewildered by ignorance. This is why we suffer, because we're bewildered by ignorance. But there's hope. And this is the last verse of this section is where he gives us hope. We establish the three doers. We establish why we're in ignorance, right? And now he's going to tell us how to get out of ignorance. And Krishna's going to assure us that when this knowledge arises, this ignorance is destroyed. It's like the sun rising, if we remember that analogy from that class. Suddenly everything becomes clear. We realize who we are, how we act, and who ultimately is behind everything. We understand these three factors of action. And this is the knowledge that we need to clear up this ignorance. The soul desires, material nature facilitates, and the Supreme Lord sanctions. And when we really realize this knowledge, it's like the sun it's like when you're camping and everything's so dark and the sun comes up and all of a sudden you can see things in their proper perspective. Everything's clear. This knowledge, it changes us. And this isn't just an intellectual shift. It's like when the sun rises, everything becomes clear. The landscape, the path, where we really are. That's what Krishna is offering us. And the karma yogi walks this path, not just towards knowledge, but towards this realization. And it's through this realization that they can experience this deep peace. So this is a big theme of this section. Where the first section, we really talked about the differences between jnana-yoga and karma yoga and why karma yoga is the recommended path. Here, in this section, we're really talking about how this knowledge of the soul can free us from bondage. Knowledge of the soul, knowledge of the three doers, knowledge of how things are actually acting. This can free us from bondage. Okay, now before we go on to the last section, does anybody want to share anything or have any questions about that one? Do you guys like these chapter overviews? Do they help kind of bring everything together at the end? Yeah, Stacy.
I am absolutely in love with Hare Krishna. I really love this overview. It just really, and especially this chapter. This chapter really is the chapter where he's like distraught, unknowing what to do. Really, sort of like, kind of when you're like, and you don't know what to do. And you're just kind of there. And that's kind of, and he says, Krishna, like you're saying this, you're saying this, you're saying this, like, I am so confused. And then Krishna really just lays it down like this. And he really says, do you want, this is how you can get it. Here's how you can get it. So it just really puts it in black and white for us. So we now know. But you're just taking it and like kind of putting it in a little nutshell for us so that we are very, if we're not reading it, if we misunderstood anything, you're saying, here's what it's saying. In case you misunderstood, this is what it's saying. So this kind of like overview, I think is fantastic. So
Great.
I'm appreciating it. Thank you very much.
Good. And always feel free to stop if I'm unclear about something or we need more details.
No,
That's really good. It helps us. It helps me just, bring it around.
Good.
Thanks.
I feel the same as I'm doing it too. as it's like, oh, okay, you can kind of see things from a more of a bird's eye view, because we get so deep into each one of these verses, which is wonderful. But yeah, going through it all, we can kind of see the context of it all. So that was, we'll call it section 2. Section 2, again, is really telling us if we understand who we are as the eternal soul, we can start to become free from bondage. Okay, so now Krishna is going to expand on this in the final section here. And it's going to, the next level, that's level 1, is understanding the eternal soul, who we are, and how just that realization can create space between the body and the soul and material nature. We can understand how all of these interact. And in that we can create some space and become free from bondage. Okay, so that's level 1. Level 2 is how by fixing the mind on God in the heart, we can attain liberation. So that's the final section here, and that's where all of this is progressing to, till we get to that final verse, which is what we talked about in the last class, which is that super bhakti verse, the peace formula, right? Okay, so now we're going to continue our march up this yoga ladder to get there. Okay, so in verse 517, Krishna tells us that when our intelligence, our mind, our faith, and our sense of refuge are all fixed on the Supreme, we can become cleansed of doubt and misgivings through spiritual knowledge. And in this, we can start moving steadily towards liberation. So this is where we talked about the 4 lanes of consciousness, right? Our mind, our faith, our intelligence, and where we're seeking shelter, right? These 4 lanes all have to be locked on that same truth. They all have to be going in the same direction. It's like when our inner compass finally locks in on true north. And all 4 aspects of our inner self here are aligned with the absolute. Okay, and when this alignment happens, we're no longer drifting or spinning our wheels, but we're actually progressing on the spiritual path. So our mind has to be in it. Our intelligence has to be used for God consciousness, right? We have to have some faith. We have to be taking some shelter there. And when all these 4 things align, we start moving towards liberation. Okay, so from this point through the end of the chapter, Krishna is guiding us through what that inner transformation looks like. Okay, how that karma yogi who fixes the mind on the Paramātmā becomes free from bondage. Paramātmā meaning Supersoul, God in the heart. So it begins with this inner alignment. Okay, and then it's going to continue with developing equal vision, and then that's where we're going next. So just kind of think of it as, just kind of situate yourself here in understanding this progression so that we can come to this place where we're fixing the mind on God in the heart. And the first is that these 4 inner lanes of consciousness have to be aligned. Our intelligence, our mind, our faith, where we're seeking shelter. And that's a pretty tall order, but that's where we are first. Okay, so then in this next verse, in 518, Krishna is describing the vision of a humble sage. If we remember this verse, it talks about one who sees a learned brahmana, a cow, an elephant, and a dog, and even a dog eater with equal vision. Okay, so at first glance, these are all like radically different beings, socially, intellectually, biologically. Okay, but the spiritually wise person is able to see beyond those external layers and recognize the spiritual equality beneath the surface. So this is the verse, this is like the great equalizer, right? Where we're like, okay, materially, we're not all equal. We're just not. Some people are, good at sports. Some people aren't. Some people are more intellectual. Some people aren't. We all have these different faculties. But the great equalizer here is that beneath it all, we're the soul. Okay, beneath it all, we're the soul. And God is in the heart of everyone. And this is the same. Everyone's soul is Satchitananda, eternal, full of knowledge, full of bliss. And this is the great equalizer. Because a cow's in the mode of goodness. An elephant's in the mode of passion. A dog's in the mode of ignorance. Everybody's influenced, everybody's vehicles are influenced by these different modes of nature. And therefore, they're going to appear different, they're going to act different, they're going to smell different, right? But the great equalizer is that we all, at our essence, are of spiritual nature. Right? And the Supersoul resides in all of us. So this is 18. This is after, we align those 4 lanes of consciousness. We get to this verse here where we're developing this equal vision. Okay, and what does this equal vision do for us? Krishna explains this in the next verse in 5:19. He says, the one who maintains this equal vision is already liberated. They've conquered birth and death, right? Not because they physically escaped the world, but because their consciousness is no longer bound by it. They're not disturbed by the changes and dualities of life. They don't even see it. They don't even see that, They can see a dog, a brahmana, a cow, all as the same. That's how transcended they are. They're not even in this material platform. Their vision is not even interpreting that. Right? Their vision is so much higher than that. And because of this, they're not disturbed by the changes and dualities of life. They don't get caught in highs and lows, praise and blame, gain and loss. Right? They've become flawless, like Brahman, beyond the influence of the mode. It's like we all have these different mode colored glasses, right? They have like transcendence colored, like they don't even have glasses. It's just like, that's it. They can really see things as they are. And because of that, they're not suffering. They no longer identify with the ever shifting material world. They've realized that the soul is transcendental and that real happiness doesn't come from external things. And that's why they can see everyone equally, because they're seeing the soul. They're not seeing the outside covering, the external package. So in verse 20, Krishna describes the consciousness of such a person. He says they're not elated when something pleasant happens, nor do they fall apart when something unpleasant comes their way. Right? And this doesn't mean that they're cold or they're emotionless. It means that they're steady. They understand that joy and sorrow, success and failure come and go like the seasons. That they've cultivated that spiritual intelligence and they know the science of God. And so their joy doesn't depend on what's happening around them because their connection is rooted within. So again, we all have different glasses of which we see and interpret material nature. Like we talked about this before, like if we're all on a train and you see a beautiful meadow and you're very sattvic, you're at that high level of material consciousness, you're going to see that beautiful meadow and think, oh, I could just go read a beautiful book underneath of it, right? But if you have those rajas, those passion colored glasses, you're going to see that meadow and think of all the things that you could build on that meadow. And if you're ignorant, you may even be sleeping so much you don't even see the meadow, or maybe that's what you want to do in the meadow. Right? So we all have these different lenses of which we perceive and interpret the world. But the transcendentalist has removed these lenses and they see things for what they really are. They don't see in terms of these different colored glasses. They see the soul. They see that they're a part of God, you're a part of God, and that God resides in all of our hearts. That's it. And so therefore they're unaffected by ups and downs. They're not affected by dualities. It doesn't mean anything to them. Okay, so this verse leads right into 5:21. And where does this kind of joy come from if not from external pleasures? Okay, because they're completely shut off from that. They don't even see it. Where are they getting joy? Because they're joyful, so there must be a source. And this is where Krishna says it comes from the self, right? It comes from inside. They've really connected with that supersoul. The person who's self-realized finds deep, lasting happiness by concentrating on the supreme. This is inner joy, right? This is the joy of spiritual connection, the joy of Brahman realization. It's a state of being where the soul tastes the sweetness of its own nature, no longer needing to chase those fleeting pleasures, because those fleeting pleasures are just like a Band-Aid, right? It's just like a Band-Aid to relieve some of our discomfort that we experience from our over-identification with our bodies, right? But when we can get this knowledge and we can really realize it, we can realize that we're not even this body, right? We're the soul. And when we can turn inwards and really meditate on that and connect with that, we can relish happiness just from that being. It's kind of unbelievable. It's kind of like amazing. And again, we have glimpses into this when we engage in spiritual practices, when we chant, when we sing kirtan, when we're feeling that just deep joy, we're connecting with that. We're connecting with Supersoul. We're connecting with God in the heart. And that's what Krishna is saying here, is the ultimate source of joy. Okay, so Krishna's building on this in 522 when he explains why the wise avoid material sense pleasures. And he says they avoid it because they're sources of misery, right? They might feel good in the moment, but they always have a beginning and an end. And with that end comes craving, disappointment, or even pain. So it's not just that the sense pleasures fade, but we become entangled in them, right? Hoping that they'll fulfill us when they never really can. And this is where we went over that FIT acronym. Anybody remember the FIT acronym to describe how material sense pleasures are? Okay, they're futile, so they don't last. Or no, that's not what that means. What does futile mean? They're hard to get, right? They're hard to get. Insubstantial, we might get them and they're not as good as we thought. And temporary. So we get them, they're good, but then they go away. Okay, so everything that we enjoy in this material energy fits into one of those categories. And that doesn't make them bad, but we should understand that this is what it is. Okay, and the only lasting fulfillment, the only substantial happiness and joy is relished internally. Right? It has to be relished internally. It can't be experienced out there, because by nature, by this design, material energy, it's all either hard to get. Once we get it, it's not that great. We get it, it's great, it's going to go away. Everything fits into those categories. Okay, so the wise person understands this, and therefore they turn their attention inwards. They get it. They've heard it. They've not only heard it, they've realized it. They've realized it, and therefore they're not affected by anything out there, and they're not even looking for anything out there. So even with this understanding, we hear this, we know it. Okay, that makes sense. I got it. Many of you are probably feeling that in this class right now. Like, okay, I can connect with that. That resonates. But still, what do we do with our desires? Because we're not quite to that place of realization yet. We haven't quite realized it to the point where we're still craving things outside of us. We're still thinking, if only my life was like this, if only I got that job, that house, that car, I'd be happy. Things would be good, right? We still feel that way sometimes. We still have these desires. So in 523, Krishna's giving us a practical instruction. He says, okay, that's fine. You're still going to have these desires. Tolerate them. And this is where we talked about tolerating not just these desires, but maybe tolerating an urge to act out in a way that doesn't align with your values, right? Which is ultimately, a false solution to something. When we act out in a way that doesn't align with our values, we're thinking that somehow that's going to make things better, when ultimately it isn't. Okay, so that's what he's saying here. When we're tempted to either maybe indulge in something that we think is going to be greatly gratifying, whether it be an external sense object or maybe a behavior, that we think is going to be externally gratifying. And we know that it's not really. We know that it's not, because we have this knowledge, but we haven't realized it to the point that our bodies, our emotions aren't completely in a line yet. That's okay. It's going to happen. Tolerate it. And if before leaving this body, we can tolerate the urges of senses and control the force of desire and anger, then we're truly well situated. Right? We can become peaceful. Not because this desire magically disappears, but because we've learned not to be ruled by it. We've at least got to that place. We may still have the desire. We may still get angry when something obstructs that desire. But at least we're at the point. At least we're at the point where we can tolerate it. We can tolerate it, and we can find a little bit of peace in there. We're not constantly giving into it. And this is what spiritual life does for us. This is what spirituality does for us. If you struggle with the addiction, or maybe compulsive, some kind of toxic behavioral pattern. This is what spiritual life does for us. When we can start to identify that, hey, that's toxic, that's not serving me. We can create some space between ourselves and that behavior. And in that, we can start to learn to tolerate it. But even higher than that, and that's where Krishna is going to take us in this next verse in 524. He's saying even higher than that is connecting to something higher. Connecting to something higher. It's not enough just to tolerate it. We have to connect to something higher. And this is where he says in 524, a person who's happy within, who's inwardly active, and whose aim is internal rather than external is a true yogi. This person is already liberated. This is the path of real happiness. Not one of withdrawing from life, but redirecting our search for joy from matter to spirit, from outward to inward. Okay, so we have this external urge, whatever it be. We have the knowledge that, hey, this isn't going to actually bring me happiness, but we still want it. Fine, tolerate it. Tolerate the urge without giving in. And in the meantime, redirect our search from joy, from matter to spirit. Because again, by nature, we seek pleasure. We're beings that seek pleasure. So we're going to look for it somewhere. We're going to look for it somewhere, and we're not going to stop until we find it somewhere. So it's not enough just to cease, whatever we're doing in this material domain for some kind of solace, or relief from misery, right? We have to seek a higher joy. And this is where we connect with God, and this is where we find it. And this is what the Gita is promising us, right? As we can deepen that inner focus, verse 25 shows that naturally we become free from dualities. So when we start to connect with Source, verse 25 tells us that we naturally become free from dualities, right? Our doubts and confusions fade, and our hearts turn toward the welfare of all beings. And this is a really beautiful point in this verse, such an important point. Real spiritual realization, it doesn't make us aloof or indifferent to others. Okay, it makes us more compassionate, more connected. We begin to see others as part of our own spiritual family. And we want to serve, not just materially, but in ways that help them reconnect with divinity. Because it's like, hey guys, you all are going to this toxic watering hole to quench your thirst. I found this watering hole that is everything that you've ever dreamed of and more. Why not go here? Because you're going to this toxic watering hole, and eventually, it may feel good in the moment. It may be super sweet to taste, but eventually you're going to have all kinds of disease and stuff from that. But this watering hole is super clean and pure. This is where the magic is. It's only going to take you higher and higher and higher. Come here. And that's what happens. You experience it for yourself. You drink from that watering hole. You experience how your thirst is quenched, how you feel actually nourished. And you feel nourished long term, not just in the short, minute that it tastes good, but long term. So when you experience that, and then you learn that, hey, this is unlimited. This watering hole, it's unlimited. So why not bring everybody here? And we can all experience this joy and relish in it together. So that's what the real spiritualist does. When they realize that, when they experience that, naturally, they want to share with others. They want to lead everybody to that watering hole, because they don't want to live in a world where they look around and everybody's like malnourished and breaking down because they drank out of the toxic one. And that's what happens when we're turning to these material pleasures for relief, for joy, for connection. Okay, but for that to happen, we have to keep purifying ourselves. Okay, and in verse 526, Krishna reminds us that liberation comes to those who are free from anger and material desires, right? Who are self-disciplined, who are always striving for spiritual perfection. So anger and desire are our inner enemies. And when we want something and we can't get it, frustration turns to anger. And that's how these two are like brothers. Anger is like the little brother of desire, because we want something, we can't get it. Anger is gonna soon follow that desire. Okay? And these emotions, they arise from this misplaced attachments. But when we begin to purify the heart, these storms begin to calm. When we realize how toxic that watering hole is, we don't even have a desire for it anymore. When we really realize it. And therefore the desire and the anger, it goes away. So this is the symptom of somebody who's self-realized, of somebody who's realized that. Okay, so now we're almost at the end of the chapter here. Just a couple left. Verses 27 and 28 are those Ashtanga verses. And Krishna is briefly pointing to that process. This eightfold path of meditation. He's describing that process of withdrawing the senses, of focusing the vision, regulating the breath, stilling the mind. Okay, that the goal is freedom from desire, fear, anger. And this is a path of deep, intense concentration meant for serious practitioners. Okay, Krishna's going to unpack it more in the next chapter, so we'll get really into it. But these verses are just like kind of a glimpse into it. And this is to say that, you practice karma yoga your whole life. You practice action. You're acting in the world, but you're being detached. Eventually, you're going to get to that point in your life where you're old and you're ready to kind of slow down. And in that, when you get to that point, Ashtanga yoga is a good option for you. You're a serious practitioner. You can mechanically situate the body so that you can turn everything inwards. And in that way, you can really connect with Supersoul inside and experience that joy. So we're going to go deeper into that, but that's just kind of a glimpse to tell us where we're going. Okay, and then finally, the last verse of the chapter, 29. This is that powerful verse where Prabhupada, he often calls this the peace formula. Okay, and this is, again, where everything culminates, where we really want to get. A person understanding these three truths can attain real peace. And these three truths are, Krishna is the ultimate enjoyer. Okay, he's the ultimate controller. And he's our best friend. And he's our best friend. Okay, so this was the CEO acronym. Controller, the enjoyer, and the omnibenevolent. So when we forget these truths, we experience conflict, anxiety, isolation. But when we truly understand them, and again, not just intellectually, but realize them in our hearts, we can let go of the burdens of the false ego, ownership, competition, mistrust. Right? And then in that surrender, the peace arises within us, and then it fills us up, and then around us, because it kind of pours out. And this is what Prabhupada called the peace formula. And this is a super bhakti verse in this chapter, because again, this is this culmination of all of these paths, which is this connection, love, and devotion for God. Okay, so we did it. That's the chapter. Krishna's walked us through what real renunciation looks like. Not just the renunciation of action, but the renunciation of attachment. Okay, he's shown us how both karma yoga and jnāna-yoga aim at the same goal, liberation from material bondage. But he also makes it clear that karma yoga, that acting in this world with detachment and spiritual purpose, is more practical and accessible, okay, especially when it's connected to devotion. And as the chapter unfolds, we see that Krishna, he's not just asking us to detach, he's inviting us to connect, okay, to move from dry renunciation to joyful conscious engagement. And this is the progression of karma yoga to bhakti yoga. Okay? If we talk karma kanda, from self-centered work to service, all the way from karma kanda to karma yoga to bhakti, right? From struggling alone to walking with him. So this is how the path of karma yoga matures into bhakti yoga, when our actions are offered with love. When we see ourselves not as controllers or enjoyers, but as instruments, as part of something sacred and whole. So the big takeaway here is that we don't have to run away from the world to be spiritual. That's good news, right? Because a lot of us have jobs and families and obligations, and we don't have to do that. We can do it. We can live it right here, right now, with those families, with our jobs, with our responsibilities. And we can still grow in spiritual consciousness. So the key is how we act, why we act, and for whom we act. Okay, I'm going to read those all three again, because these things should be in our mind as we're going through our days, engaging in our responsibilities, right? How are we acting? Is it in line with my value system, with my principles? Why are we acting? And for whom we act? That's a big one, right? For whom we act. Can we do our service for God? So Krishna is ending this chapter by reminding us that if we fix our mind on him, we'll find peace, joy, liberation, even in this life. And that's the message, the message that we need to remember. We need to practice day by day. So that's this chapter in a nutshell. We just went through every single verse. Does anybody want to share any big takeaways or anything that really resonated with them? Overall reflections of the chapter?
Hey, hi again. I didn't raise my hand this time. Sorry.
Great.
But this is a quick one, but I just remember somewhere in a few weeks ago in this chapter process, getting to the point where I was thinking, please, can you just come on? Remember when I was talking about fake it till you make it? Like,
Yeah.
act like a devotee, like during class and while we're listening to lectures and during our japa, we're like, we can be there. And then we go out to work. And for me, sometimes it's just like instantaneously falls out, the window or whatever. So, yeah, just even to put in my mind, like, okay, this person is really difficult. I do have resentment. I do have difficulty. It's okay to sit in that uncomfortability, which was also a really good one to go over in this chapter. But just, hey, are you acting like a devotee? Like, come on, you're not all the way there, but you are a devotee, and how we want to, interact outwardly and inwardly. So that was really helpful to me. Like, come on, this is not how a devotee acts. And looking for wonderful examples of each other. And yeah, so thank you.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect demonstration too of that tolerance. We tolerate whatever urge we're having. Just like you said, we recognize, okay, this isn't how I want to act. I'm going to tolerate this urge. And then we connect to something higher. Maybe that night go to a kirtan or come to a class, and then see how your perspective changes and see even how your urges change over time. You'll experience it right in that moment. Like, oh, wow, I definitely don't want to do that. It'll become clear to you. But then as you progress through the path, those urges will have less of a grip on you as well, which is like the beautiful result of what spiritual life has to offer us when we really take shelter in God. We develop that level of maturity. That level of maturity is that barrier between our emotions and our actions. Yeah, thank you. Stacy.
I was just going to talk, but I know sometimes you don't see the hand. And of course, I always have something to say, like Katie. Katie and I are chatters. But it's so nice to share. Like, honestly, like it used to be where I was just like, and you know me for a long time, where I was talking to fill the quiet because I was so uncomfortable with the quiet. And I was like, so what are you doing? Oh, you're dating? You're like just like nonsense. It's literally like Prabhupada would say, nonsense. But now it's, I'm having this conversation about like what I love about this chapter is my mind is quiet. My soul is open. I am this chapter changed my life in and so many others, but this chapter really brings it home for me, where I went from being this like, just material person. No, I was not so materialistic, but I was, and as many of us were at some point, but when I moved into the spiritual side of yoga, my whole life changed. And yeah, and this chapter just has it all right in there, like just boom. So I want to thank you so much for just sharing it the way you did.
Oh, nice. Thank you. Thank you, Stacy.
Yeah.
Such a testament to the process. Thank you. Maria, I see you. I love it. I never know what Maria's going to say. I never know if she's going to be like, that's not me at all.
Well, actually, some of the things we've been reading just really hit home. sometimes I feel like I don't really want to be around people because I'm experiencing so much of this inner bliss, this connection with spirit, that I don't want anything distracting me from it. But yet it's nice to share it with other people. But this kind of explains to me why part of me just wants to go to the forest, basically, and just live in that bliss and let it be.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. That being said, you know, as we progress and as we become deeper in our realizations, it will become like a natural little bubble around us that it's like we're not influenced by, you know, I'm not there yet, but I know it happens. And we can see it happening gradually. Like I see myself less affected by, you know, things and people that I would have been affected by before, though I'm still super affected by like my family, you know, so that really shows us where our attachments are and where our work is. Um, but yeah, I can understand that feeling for sure. That's part of it too, is protecting ourselves too. You know, we have to know how much we're ready to handle so that we're protecting that little bubble. Because at the beginning too, it could be pretty vulnerable. It could pop easily, and we want to protect it so that it can grow and thicken and yeah, really shield us. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, well, let's say Thursday, we'll start chapter 6, the Ashtanga-yoga chapter. And then after that, we're through the karma yoga section and we'll start bhakti. We'll probably do bhakti the rest of the year. So that'll be beautiful. I'm excited to continue this journey with you all. And thanks for showing up and for doing the work and for being a part of this community, walking each other home. So thank you. We'll see you on Thursday.
Hare Krishna, Radha Priti.
Hare
Hare
Krishna.
Krishna. Hare Krishna.